The gun was already out, pointed straight at Clara. 200 people in that room. Nobody moved. Dylan Vance, the most powerful man in Crestwood County, had just won in court. The ranch was gone. The deed was gone. Everything her father built, gone. And still. He needed her dead. This ends now, he said. Nobody spoke. Then one man stepped forward. No weapon, no badge. Just a scarred hand and 12 years of guilt he was finally done carrying. He stood between Clara and the barrel. You're in a room full of witnesses, Vance. Every single one of them is watching you right now. The room held its breath. Then the judge stood up. The man who had looked away for 12 years stood up, and Dylan Vance understood for the first time that he had made one fatal mistake. He forgot her last name. This is Clara May Hargrove Whitfield. And this is how she took it all back. The sun hadn't risen yet. The sky was the color of an old bruise. Purple fading into grey. Grey fading into nothing. Clara May Hargrove rode alone. She did this every morning, had done it for 3 months now. Ever since they put her father in the ground on a cold January Tuesday. Ever since the preacher said his words, and Butters Nibbers nodded and went home to their warm suppers. She rode the fence line, all 400 acres of it. Her horse, a bay mare named Dulcie, knew the route by heart. Clara barely had to steer. She just sat in the saddle and let Dulcie carry her. And as they moved through the half-dark, Clara reached out her left hand. She touched each fence post as they passed. 1, 2, not counting, just touching. Her father had built this fence. Post by post, summer of 1861. She wasn't born yet. He was a young man then, just arrived in North Texas with 2 mules, a hammer, and a deed he'd earned through honest work. She touched the posts the way you touch the hand of someone you love, because that's what it was, really. It was the only piece of him still standing. They came around the eastern edge just as the sky began to lighten. The old creek bed ran along this stretch, dried up in summer, but you could still see where it had been. The land dipped and curved, following the ghost of old water. Clara's hand found the next post. She stopped. Dulcie felt it too. The mare shifted under her, ears forward. Clara looked at the post, then she looked at the ground around it. She stepped down from the saddle without thinking. Her boots found the dirt. She crouched low, ran her fingers along the base of the post where it met the earth. The soil was wrong. Not dry and packed the way it should be. It was loose, disturbed. The kind of loose you get when something's been pulled up and put back. She looked at the next post down the line, and the next. Then she pulled a small length of twine from her coat pocket. An old habit. Her father had taught her. Always carry something to measure with, Clara. The eye lies. The string doesn't. She measured from the post to the natural line of the fence. 3 feet. The post had been moved 3 feet inward. She stood up slowly, looked down the fence line, tried to see how far the change went. In the early light, she couldn't tell, but she knew someone had been on this land in the night. Someone had pulled her fence posts, reset them, moved her boundary inward, toward the house, away from the creek. 3 feet doesn't sound like much. 3 feet across 400 acres is a different thing entirely. She stood there for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once and went quiet. Clara remounted Dulcie. She didn't ride faster. She didn't panic. She just toward the house. And she thought, 3 months ago her father had died. The doctor said it was his heart. Said Samuel Hargrove had simply worn out. Said it happens to men who work hard their whole lives. Said it with a professional sadness that felt rehearsed. Clara had stood in that small examination room and looked at her father's hands, big hands, calloused from 40 years of work. And she had thought, these hands built a fence that stood through 2 droughts and a flood. These hands don't just quit, but she had no words for what she felt, no evidence. Nothing but a daughter's instinct. So she buried him, and she kept the land. And every morning she rode the fence line and touched the posts he'd set, because the land was all that was left of Samuel Hargrove, and she would not let it go. Back at the house, she unsaddled Dulcie and stood at the water trough. She washed her hands, looked at them, thought about her father's. The kitchen light was already on. Edna Marsh was awake. Edna was always awake before Clara. The woman was 65 years old and still rose before dawn, like she owed the morning something. She'd come west with the Hargrove family from Tennessee when she was barely 30. She'd stayed. She'd never said why exactly. She'd just stayed. Clara came through the back door. The smell of coffee and cornbread hit her like a warm hand. "You're later than usual," Edna said without turning from the stove. "Eastern fence line," Clara said. Edna turned then. She had a way of reading Clara that needed no explanation. 30 years of watching this family had given her that. "What did you find?" Clara sat at the table, wrapped her hands around the coffee mug Edna set in front of her, felt the heat seep into her fingers. Posts moved, eastern section. At least 3 feet inward, maybe more. Edna was quiet for a moment. "How far does it run?" "I don't know yet. I'll check in full daylight." Edna set down her spoon. She looked out the kitchen window at the lightening sky. Something moved across her face, a worry she didn't voice. "You'll ride into town today?" she asked. Her voice was careful. "Too careful, I'll need to." "For supplies anyway." Edna nodded. Turned back to the stove, Clara watched her. There was something Edna wasn't saying. There almost always was lately. Clara could feel it, a held breath, a sentence that kept stopping before it started. She didn't push, not yet. She drank her coffee and watched the sun come up through the window. Out past the barn, the land stretched wide and golden. Every morning it did this. Every morning it looked like a promise. Keep it, the land seemed to say. Just keep it. Crestwood, Texas was not a large town. Maybe 400 people. A main street that ran a quarter mile before turning to wagon ruts. A church at one end, a saloon at the other, and everything a small town needed in between: feed store, dry goods, a livery. A small post office that doubled as a telegraph office, Dr. Aldridge's surgery. The sheriff's, which was more often than not occupied only by Deputy Calhoun Birch. Since Sheriff Maddox had a bad knee and a strong preference for his office chair, and at the center of it all, the Crestwood Savings and Land Bank. It was the finest building on the street. 2 stories. Brick, not timber. Glass windows that caught the afternoon light. A painted sign above the door, gold letters on black. Inside, behind the best desk in 3 counties, sat Dylan Vance. Clara had been to town a dozen times since her father's funeral. Each time, she felt the shift. The way conversations paused when she passed. The way people looked at her just a half second too long before looking away. It was not hostility. It was something quieter than that. Pity, maybe. Or its cousin, discomfort. People didn't know what to do with a 28-year-old woman alone on 400 acres. It didn't fit. It made them uneasy in a way they couldn't quite name. She hitched Dulcie outside Floyd Garrett's dry goods store. Floyd was one of the few people in Crestwood who had always treated her like a full human being. He'd known her father for 20 years. White-haired now, slow-moving, with hands spotted from decades of work. He didn't offer sympathy. He just dealt with her straight. She gave him her list. He filled the order. As he bagged the last of it, he paused, slid a small paper-wrapped packet across the counter. Little extra salt. No charge. Clara looked at him. He was already turning away, busying himself with a shelf that didn't need straightening. She took the salt. Didn't ask. But as she stepped out onto the boardwalk, she understood something. The salt wasn't generosity. Floyd Garrett was not a careless man. He didn't give things away by accident. It was a message. She just didn't know what it meant yet. "Miss Hargrove." The voice came from behind her, smooth, pleasant. The kind of voice that had been trained to sound warm. She turned. Dylan Vance stood on the boardwalk outside his bank. He was perhaps 50, silver at the tipples, good suit recently brushed. The boots were the expensive kind, narrow-toed, not a scuff on them. He had the look of a man who had never, in his adult life, done physical labor. "I'm glad I caught you," he said, smiling. "I've been meaning to call on you at the ranch, but I thought you might prefer the walk over here. Easier for a conversation." Clara said nothing. She waited. He gestured toward his office. "Come in for a moment. Just a moment. I have coffee on." There are times when you know exactly what a room will feel like before you enter it. Clara knew. But she went anyway, because you need to know what you're dealing with. Vance's office was warm and well-furnished. A large desk of dark walnut, leather chairs, a painting of horses on the far wall, a small American flag in a stand by the window, everything carefully chosen. Everything saying, "I am successful, I am respectable." You can trust me. He poured the coffee himself, set it in front of her, sat down across the desk. I want you to know, he began, that I have enormous respect for what your father built. Samuel Hargrove was a hard man, a good man. Crestwood is poorer for losing him. Clara waited, which is why I want to help if I can. He folded his hands on the desk. I won't pretend there isn't a business matter between us. That wouldn't be honest. And I think you'd rather have honesty. I would, Clara said. He reached into a desk drawer, placed a document on the table, between them, turned it to face her. Your father had an outstanding loan with this bank. $340. Taken out last November. Clara looked at the paper, looked at the figure, looked at the signature line. She didn't touch it. The terms allow 60 days from the date of the borrower's death for repayment or negotiation. That window, he continued, closes in 14 days. Clara looked up. Or, Vance said, his voice shifting into something softer, you sign the transfer agreement I have prepared. I'll pay $800. Clean and legal. You'd walk away with money in your pocket, and you wouldn't have to carry this alone anymore. He let that sit. $800 was real money. It would last a careful person 2 years, and he knew she was alone, and he knew she knew it. I appreciate your directness, Mr. Vance, Clara said. She stood, picked up her gloves. My father did not borrow $340. Not from this bank, not from anyone. I've been through every paper in his study, every drawer, every box. There is no record of a loan. Vance watched her. I suggest you check your records again, she said. Good day. She walked out. Behind her, she heard nothing. Not a word, not a sound. The silence of a man choosing his next move. Outside, she untied Dulcie and rode slowly up the main street. She didn't look back at the bank, but she thought about that document on the desk. She hadn't touched it, but she'd seen it. Every detail registered, filed, stored. Another old habit from her father. Look long enough to remember. Don't let them see you looking. The signature, the date, the notary stamp. She rode home with those details sitting in her mind, waiting. 2 days after her visit to Vance, a man appeared at the gate, late afternoon. Clara was replacing a loose board on the barn door when she heard the horse. She straightened, shaded her eyes. He was a big man. Not tall, exactly, but substantial, wide through the shoulders. He rode a dark horse, well kept despite the dust on both of them. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed. Sun-dark face. The kind of weathered that comes from years outdoors, not weeks. He stopped at the gate. Didn't push through, Miss Hargrove. That's right. Name's Eli Cole. I heard you might be needing hired help. Clara looked at him. Who told you that? Floyd Garrett. At the dry goods. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then back at him. Step down, Mr. Cole. Let's talk. He came through the gate. She didn't ask him inside. They stood in the yard, the late sun stretching their shadows long across the dirt. She watched him the way her father had taught her to watch people. Not staring, just paying attention, the way he positioned himself. Back to nothing, face to everything. Alert without performing alertness. The scar on his right hand, old. Running across the knuckles and down toward the wrist. The kind of scar you get from years of a specific kind of work. She'd seen scars like that before. On men who carried guns for a living, his eyes moved without being obvious about it. He'd clocked the barn, the house, the approach road, probably in the first 10 seconds. Not suspicious. Just practiced. What kind of work have you done? She asked. Most kinds. Cattle, fencing, carpentry. I can work horses. Can read land for water if you need a new well dug. Whatever a working ranch needs, you have references? Not written ones. Men I've worked for are scattered across 3 states. I can give you names. Where were you before this? A small pause. Abilene. Short-term work, and before that. He met her eyes, various places. I don't stay long anywhere. She noted that he said it without apology. Not defensive. Just honest. Do you have a gun, Mr. Cole? I do. Do you use it? Another pause. This one longer. Only when there's no other way. Clara looked at him steadily. He looked back. No performance in it. No effort to charm or persuade. She thought about the moved fence posts, about the document in Vance's office, about the 14 days closing around her like a wall. She thought about what it meant to be one person on 400 acres with no allies and no plan. Bunkhouses behind the barn, she said. Dinner's at 6. You start tomorrow morning. Eli Cole worked the way a good man works. Without noise, he was up before she was. When she came out for the morning ride, he was already in the barn, feeding and watering the horses. He'd noticed that one of the stall doors had a broken hinge and fixed it without being asked. He kept to himself, took his meals at the table, but didn't fill silence with words. Edna assessed him in about 3 minutes, and thereafter treated him with the efficient respect she reserved for people who did not require managing. On the third day, Clara was checking the eastern fence line again, measuring, marking, documenting how far the posts had been moved. Ellie walked up beside her, looked at the ground. He crouched, studied the disturbed soil, looked along the line. This wasn't done in a hurry, he said. Whoever did this took their time. Multiple nights, probably. I thought so too. They wanted it to look gradual. Natural settling. It won't hold up, Clara said. I have the original survey documents, my father's measurements. Everything's recorded. Ellie stood. Looked toward the direction of town. Is there a survey dispute filed with the county? Not yet. But I expect one, he nodded. Said nothing else. But something in the way he nodded said, I've seen this before. She did not ask him where or when. Not yet. On the 5th she found something else. She had been going through her father's study again, methodically, the way she'd done 3 times already. But this time she went slower, lifted things instead of just looking at them, moved books off shelves and checked the backs. Behind a row of agricultural journals on the bottom shelf, she found a small tin box. Inside, correspondence, old letters, a few documents, and at the bottom a sealed envelope with her name on it. She stared at it for a long time. Then she put it back, not because she was afraid of what was in it, but because she'd learned something from her father about patience. Don't open the thing until you know how to use what's inside. She didn't know yet, so she waited. That evening she sat on the porch after supper. The sky had gone purple and orange. The first stars were showing. Ellie came out and sat on the step a few feet away. Neither of them spoke for a while. Can I ask you something? Clara said eventually. You can. Why did Floyd Garrett send you to me? Ellie was quiet for a moment. Looking out at the land, he said you needed help you could trust, he said, and that you were running out of time to find it. And why did you come? Another pause. Longer, because I owed a debt to someone. Someone I can't repay anymore. Floyd said maybe I could do something useful here instead. Clara turned to look at him. Who did you owe the debt to? The question sat in the air between them. Eli looked at his hands. The scarred right one. The older, quieter left one. A man named Samuel Hargrove, he said quietly. He came to see me once. A long time ago. Said something I wasn't ready to hear. I walked away from him. I've regretted it every day since. The stars had come out fully now. A whole sky of them. Clara didn't say anything for a long time. Then, you knew my father. I knew of him. He came to find me. I was in a different place then. I didn't listen. What did he say to you? Eli rubbed his hand over his jaw. He said I was working for the wrong man, and that it would cost me more than I understood. Was he right? A long silence. Yes, Eli said. He was right. Clara pulled her coat tighter against the night air. Who were you working for, Mr. Cole? He turned and looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not guilt exactly. Something older. Something that had been carried a very long time. That's what I owe you the truth about, he said. But I need you to hear it all before you decide what to do with it. Then tell me, he folded his hands. Not tonight, he said. Tomorrow, when I've figured out the right words. She accepted that. She was her father's daughter, after all. Some things need a night to find their shape. The next morning, before Eli could find his words, the trouble arrived first. A man rode up to the gate just after breakfast, young, official-looking, riding a horse with a county brand on the flank. He wore a badge Clara didn't recognize. Not Crestwood. County. He handed her an envelope through the gate, didn't dismount, tipped his hat and rode back toward the town before she'd even finished reading the return address. She opened it at the kitchen table. Edna and Eli stood on either side. Neither crowded her. It was a legal notice from the county court in the matter of delinquent debt. Samuel R. Hargrove, deceased, and the Crestwood Savings and Land Bank. The language was formal and dense, but the meaning was simple. The court had registered the loan. had confirmed the 60-day repayment window. A hearing was scheduled to determine the disposition of the property if the debt remained unpaid. In 13 days, Clara set the paper down. She looked at the signature at the bottom. Judge Emmett Greer, presiding, 3rd District Court of Crestwood County. Then she looked at the loan document number referenced in the notice. She wrote it down. Then she went to the study and pulled out every financial record her father had kept. She was there for 3 hours. Samuel Hargrove had kept meticulous records. This was a man who did not trust vague memory. He wrote things down, kept copies, dated them, organized them by year. It was one of the things that had made him good at the work he'd done before ranching. The work Clara was only now beginning to understand fully. She went through everything, every transaction, every purchase, every debt incurred and paid. There was no record of any loan from the Crestwood Savings and Land Bank. Not in November, not in October, not in any month of 1886. No receipt, no loan agreement copy, no repayment schedule, nothing. In 23 years of careful record-keeping, Samuel Hargrove had never missed documenting a financial obligation. The loan did not exist. She brought the notice to Deputy Calhoun Birch. Calhoun Birch was a decent man. She'd known him since she was a girl. He was maybe 35 now, sandy-haired, earnest in the way of someone who had grown up believing the rules were there for a reason. He read the notice. "Read it again. I'm sorry, Clara," he said. "If the court's registered it, there's a process. You'd need to bring your own documentation to the hearing. Contest the loan. My father kept 23 years of records. There's no loan. Then you bring that to Judge Greer, and Judge Greer will listen." Calhoun looked at her. Then, for just a moment, his eyes moved sideways, toward the window, toward the street, toward, if she read it right, the direction of the bank. It was a small movement. He probably didn't even know he'd made it. "He's a fair man," Calhoun said. But his voice had something flat in it. Clara took the notice back, folded it. "Thank you, Calhoun," she said. She walked out on the street. She stood for a moment in the morning light. People moved past her, going about their days. And not one of them, she noticed, met her eyes. That afternoon she compared signatures. She spread her father's documents across the study desk, arranged them chronologically. 23 years of Samuel Hargrove's handwriting. Then she set the loan document. The copy Vance had shown her in his office, the same one referenced in the court notice, beside them. She had not touched it when Vance showed it to her, but she had looked, carefully. And she remembered exactly what she'd seen. She could replicate the signature as she'd observed it from memory. She sketched it on a blank paper. Then she looked at her father's real signatures, 20, 30, 40 examples. One feature appeared in every single one. Without exception, the capital S in Samuel, the way her father formed it, upright, clean. A particular angle at the top curve that was almost architectural. The signature she'd sketched from memory, the one on the loan document, had the S curving to the right at the top. Rounded, soft, different hand, same name. Someone had forged her father's signature. And then she looked more closely at her sketch. She'd drawn the letters quickly, from memory, not thinking too carefully. And something about the overall shape of it nagged at her. She looked again, the pen pressure, the rhythm of the strokes, the slight forward lean of the letters. Her mind moved somewhere uncomfortable. She knew that handwriting, not well, not from many samples, but she had seen it. She stood up from the desk, walked to the kitchen doorway. Edna's was at the sink. Clara stood there for a moment, said nothing, because she might be wrong. And if she was wrong, the question itself could do harm, real harm. And if she was right, then what she was seeing was not betrayal. It was something more complicated. Something that needed the whole truth before judgment. She went back to the desk, closed the documents, and decided she would wait until she understood everything. That night, Eli Cole sat down across from her at the kitchen table. Edna was in the next room. The lamp between them was low. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the grass in long, slow waves. "You still want to hear it?" he asked. "I do." He looked at the table, not avoiding her, just finding his starting place. 12 years ago, he said, "I was hired muscle, not a killer. I want you to understand that. I never killed anyone. But I was the kind of man you hire when you want people scared. When you want them moved, Clara said nothing. There was a man. Called himself a banker. We called him the banker because none of us used real names in that work. He'd hire us for a season, move us on. We didn't ask questions. The money was good. What did you do for him? Pressured people, showed up at farms, told folks their papers weren't in order. Sometimes broke things, not people, just things. Just enough to make them want to leave, and they left. Most of them. Some didn't. Those ones got harder pressure, and the land went to the banker. The land went to the banker. The wind moved outside. The lamp flame shifted. The last job I did for him, Eli said, was a family. Old couple, the husband was sick. They had a place east of here. Good water on it. The banker wanted it. What was their name? Delacroix. French name. Louisiana family, come west. What happened? We showed up. 3 of us. Told them their deed wasn't filed right, that the land had reverted to county. It was a lie. But they didn't have money for a lawyer to prove otherwise. The old man could barely stand. Eli's hands were flat on the table. Still, they left, he said. I watched them go, and I felt. He stopped. Started again. I felt nothing. That's what I'm most ashamed of. Not what I did. That I felt nothing when I did it. Clara looked at him steadily. And then your father came to find me. How he found me, I don't know. He came to the bunkhouse where I was staying. Sat down like we were old friends. Didn't threaten, didn't judge. Just said, son, you're working for a man who is going to use you up and throw you away. And the things he has you doing, they don't wash off. You should know that. What did you say? I laughed at him. Told him to mind his own business. And he left. Eli turned his scarred hand over on the table. 3 weeks later, I quit. I'd been thinking about what he said. Couldn't stop thinking about it. So I quit and rode north. Figured I'd find different work. And your family. Something moved across his face. It came and went fast, but she saw it. I had a wife, Sarah, and my brother Boyd was living with us that year. He'd come to help with the place. What happened to them? He was quiet for a moment. I got a letter from a man in Abilene. Told me there'd been a fire, house burned. Sarah and Boyd were gone. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second. I believed it was my fault, Eli said. For 12 years, I thought I'd been careless. Left something burning. Some accident I caused without knowing, he paused. That's a particular kind of thing to live with. Believing you killed the people you loved through your own stupidity. But you don't believe that now. He looked at her. 2 weeks ago, coming through the Panhandle, I stopped at a roadhouse outside Amarillo. Man there recognized me. Name was Briggs. He'd been one of the banker's men too. He was drunk, feeling confessional. What did he tell you? He told me the banker had Sarah and Boyd put out of the house by force after I quit. Sent men. They were told to go. Gave them nothing. Told them the property had been seized and the fire? Briggs set it himself. After they were gone, to cover the eviction. To make it look clean, the kitchen was very quiet. Sarah and Boyd made it to Abilene, Eli said, his voice even and controlled now. The way a man speaks when the emotion underneath is too large to let out all at once. They made it. But it was winter, and they had nothing, and Boyd's lungs were never strong. He went first. Sarah followed 2 weeks later. Clara reached across the table, put her hand over his scarred one. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that was equal to it. They sat like that for a moment. Then Eli said, the banker. I know now who he is. I've known since I crossed into Crestwood County and heard the name. Dylan Vance, Clara said. Dylan Vance. Outside, the wind surged. The lamp flame flattened and then steadied. That's why you came, she said. Not just for my father. I came because of your father. Because he was the only person who ever told me the truth, and I wasn't ready to hear it. And because, he stopped. Because if I can do something right here, on the land he built, for the daughter he raised, maybe that's the closest I'll ever get to settling the account. Clara sat back in her chair. She thought about her father. Riding out to find this man, sitting down in some dusty bunkhouse, telling the truth plainly, without weapons or drama, just words. You're working for the wrong man. That was Samuel Hargrove. That was exactly Samuel Hargrove. She thought about the signature on that loan document, the one she hadn't asked Edna about yet. She thought about the fence posts moved in the night, about the court notice with 13 days on it, about Vance's smooth office and his polished boots and his $800 in careful handwriting, and she thought about the sealed envelope with her name on it, sitting in the tin box behind her father's journals. Don't open the thing until you know how to use what's inside. She was getting closer, Mr. Cole, she said. Eli. He looked at her. Tomorrow, she said. I need to know everything you know about Vance. How he operates, who he uses, how he moves, all of it. I'll tell you everything, and I need you to understand something. She met his eyes. I'm not running, I'm not selling, and I'm not spending 13 days waiting for a court to decide what belongs to me. He looked at her for a long moment. Something settled in his face. A decision being made. No, he said quietly. I didn't figure you were. She woke at 3 a.m. to the smell of smoke. By the time she reached the yard, the small storage shed on the eastern edge was burning. Not the barn, not the house, just the shed. But it was deliberate. She knew it the moment she saw it. The fire was too centered, too specific. Eli was already there, bucket in hand, working the water trough. She grabbed a second bucket and worked beside him. Edna appeared on the porch with a lantern, watching, giving them light to work by. It took 40 minutes. They saved the structure mostly, lost what was stored inside. Old tools, feed bags, a spare saddle she'd used since she was 12. When it was down to embers, Eli walked the perimeter, looking at the ground, 3 sets of hoof prints. Coming from the north, leaving west. They'd watched their timing, come in, done the work, left clean. Clara stood at the edge of the blackened ground, looked at the sky, which was beginning to turn. An hour till dawn. They're not trying to destroy you, Eli said, coming up beside her. Not yet. This is a message, I know. They want you scared. They want you to feel like it's going to keep happening. Bigger each time, I know, she said again. She looked at the embers. The spare saddle her father had repaired with his own hands. Gone now, but the land was still there, every acre of it, under the same sky it had always been under. Let them send their messages, she said. She turned toward the house. I'll send one back. 12 days, that was the number Clara woke up with. Sat with it over coffee, carried it out to the barn. 12 days before the court hearing. 12 days before Judge Emmett Greer would rule on a debt that didn't exist. She had spent 4 days watching, learning, taking stock. Now it was time to move, she told Eli at breakfast. Laid it out plain. We need 3 things before that hearing. First, proof the loan is fraudulent. Second, a witness willing to stand up in court. Third, something that explains why Vance wants this land badly enough to forge documents and burn sheds. Ellie wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, listened. The fraud we can argue with my father's records, Clara continued. But records alone aren't enough. Greer will find a reason to discount them. We need a person. Someone who was there. Someone who saw something. And the third thing? Eli asked. The third thing is the most important. She set down her cup. Nobody goes to this kind of trouble for 400 acres of grass. There's a reason Vance wants this specific land. I intend to find out what it is. Edna was at the stove. Her back was to them. But Clara noticed her shoulders had gone very still. She rode to see Martha Penfield that morning. Martha lived 2 miles east of town, widow of a man named Gerald Penfield, who had worked the mines up near the Palo Duro area in the late 70s before a collapse ended that chapter of his life. After the accident, they'd moved to Crestwood. Gerald had died in 1879. Martha had stayed. She was 70 years old, sharp as glass and twice as tough. Clara had known her growing up. Martha had been friends with Samuel, not close friends. The kind of friends that small towns make. People who share space and history, and a general understanding of who can be trusted. Martha opened the door before Clara knocked. I saw you coming up the road, she said. Get inside. I've got the coffee on. The house was small and neat. Everything in it had been made to last. Nothing decorative, nothing wasteful. The home of someone who had learned to value only what held up. They sat at a table that had seen 40 years of meals. You're here about the land, Martha said. I am. Then I've been waiting for you. She stood, went to a cabinet in the far corner, reached into the back of the bottom shelf, brought out a flat leather case, the kind used for documents. It was old. The leather was cracking at the edges. She set it on the table between them. Gerald brought this home one night in the spring of 1882, she said. He wouldn't tell me where he got it. Just said he'd found something he wasn't supposed to see. Told me to keep it hidden. Told me if anything happened to him, I should hold on to it until the right person came asking. She opened the case. Inside was a map, surveyor's work professional and precise. It covered the north-central section of Crestwood County. Every parcel of land labeled, every boundary marked. In the lower right corner, a company name, Halloran & Sons Geological Survey, Houston, Texas. And across the map in red ink, someone had drawn circles, estimated boundaries. Notes in a cramped technical hand. Clara looked at the circles. One of them sat directly over the Hargrove Ranch. Beneath it, in that same cramped writing, 2 words, probable formation. She looked up at Martha. Dill formation, Martha said quietly. That's what Gerald said. Under the ground. Oil. Clara looked back at the map. The words settled into her like a stone into still water, slow. Then spreading oil. The first wells in Texas had come in east of here. Everyone knew that. But the geologists had been moving west for years, quietly, looking for the next formation, the next pool. Vance knew. Somehow Vance knew what was under this land before anyone else did. And Samuel Hargrove had been sitting on top of it for 20 years without knowing. Gerald, Clara said carefully. How did he come to have this map? Martha folded her hands. He was doing survey work for a company out of Houston, seasonal work. He came across this map in an office he wasn't supposed to be in. He understood enough to know what it meant. She paused. 2 months later, he had his accident. The word accident sat in the air between them. You think it wasn't an accident, Clara said, I think. Martha said evenly. That Gerald Penfield had worked around mines his whole life. He knew how to be careful, and I think the timing was very convenient for certain people. She tapped the map with one finger. I couldn't prove it. I still can't. But I kept this map, because someday I thought the truth would need it. Clara looked at the woman across the table, 70 years old, sitting on this secret for 8 years. Waiting, can I take this? Clara asked. That's why you're here, Martha said. She rode back slowly, thinking the land, the oil, the map. Now it had a shape. Now she could see the thing whole. Vance hadn't decided to take her land on a whim. This had been building for years. Maybe since 1882, when that survey was done. Maybe longer. He'd been patient. He'd been methodical. He'd waited for the right moment. The right moment came when Samuel Hargrove died. And if Samuel's death wasn't natural, if it was part of the plan, she stopped that thought, filed it. Not yet. She needed more before she could go there. She needed to talk to Edna. She had been avoiding it. That was the honest truth. She had seen the shape of Edna's handwriting in that forged signature 4 days ago, and she had chosen not to ask, because asking meant the answer was real. And the answer, if it was what she feared, would hurt in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. But 12 days, now 11, didn't leave room for gentleness. She found Edna in the garden, late afternoon. The old woman was on her knees, working the soil around the winter vegetables with a small hand fork. Her movements were slow and deliberate, the way they always were. Edna Marsh did not rush. Clara crouched beside her. Edna kept working. You need to tell me about the loan document, Clara said. The hand fork stopped. Edna did not look up immediately. She looked at the soil in front of her, at her own hands. Hands that had been in this garden for 30 years. Then she sat back on her heels, and she looked at Clara. I've been waiting for you to ask, she said, and dreading it. Both at the same time. Tell me. Edna pulled off her garden gloves, folded them across her knee. It was the week before Christmas, she said. You were in town. Samuel was in bed. He'd been feeling poorly for weeks. I thought it was the cold. I thought he needed rest. Clara listened, kept her face still. 2 men came to the door. I didn't know them. They said they were from the bank. Said Samuel had agreed to meet with them about a financial arrangement. I told them he was unwell and couldn't see anyone. They said it would only take a moment, that it was important. She paused. I shouldn't have let them in. I know that. I knew it then. But Samuel had seemed so tired, and I thought if it was bank business, maybe it needed to be handled. Maybe it would be one less thing for him to worry about. They came inside, Clara said. They came inside. And they were polite, very polite. The way that certain kind of man is polite when he means to get something done. Her voice was steady, but her hands, still holding the folded gloves, pressed together harder. They showed me a document, said it was a routine loan agreement that Samuel had already approved verbally, that he just needed to put his name to it, and Samuel wasn't there. Samuel was in his room, asleep. She stopped, drew a breath. They said they didn't want to wake him, said I could witness it on his behalf, that it was perfectly legal, that it was just a formality. Clara waited, and then one of them said, Edna's voice changed. The steadiness cracked at its edge. Not much, but enough, he said. Mrs. Marsh, we know Miss Clara rides out alone most mornings. The eastern fence line, before sunup. Long way from anyone, the garden was very quiet. He didn't say anything else, he didn't have to. Edna looked at Clara. Her eyes were clear, old and tired and clear. I signed it. I wrote Samuel's name as best I could. I signed as witness, and then they left. And I have not slept a full night since. Clara sat with that for a long moment. She thought about what it would feel like to have a man stand in your kitchen and describe your daughter's morning ride. The darkness, the distance, the aloneness of it. She thought about Edna, 65 years old, who had followed this family from Tennessee at the age of 30 and never left, who had cooked 30 years of meals and mended 30 years of clothes and sat by the bedside through 30 years of sickness, who had, in one terrible moment, tried to protect Clara the only way she thought she could. You were protecting me, Clara said. I failed Samuel. I failed you. Edna's voice was flat with a kind of exhausted honesty. There is no good version of what I did. You were threatened. By men who knew exactly how to threaten you. That's not absolution. No, Clara said. It's not. But it is the truth. And right now the truth is what I need. She put her hand over Edna's. You are my witness, Clara said. Do you understand that? You are the person who can testify to what happened. Who those men were. What they said. What they made you do. Edna looked at her. They'll deny it, she said. Vance will say I signed of my own free will. He'll say Samuel told me to do it. He'll make me look like a confused old woman. Maybe, Clara said. But you'll tell the truth in front of whoever will listen, and the truth matters. Even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard to hear. She squeezed Edna's hands once, then let go. Especially then. Edna looked out at the garden. At 30 years of tended earth, your father, she said quietly, would be furious with me. My father, Clara said, would understand completely, and then he'd tell you to stand up and do the right thing now, because that's who he was. Edna was quiet for a moment, then she put her garden gloves back on and picked up her hand fork. Then I'll stand up, she said, and went back to her work. The next morning Vance came to her. Not a messenger, not a letter, Vance himself, riding up the main road to the Hargrove ranch in a good buggy pulled by a matched pair of bays. Dressed for business, 2 men on horseback behind him. Clara saw them coming from 200 yards out. She had time to stand up from what she was doing, repairing the gate latch, and simply watch them arrive. Eli appeared beside her. He'd seen them too. The man on the left, Eli said quietly. Walt Malone, they called him Chess. He's been with Vance a long time. Clara looked at the man. Broad, weathered, maybe 45. He rode with the ease of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. His eyes moved constantly. Taking stock. Do you know him? Clara asked. We worked together, Eli said, years ago. Before I quit, Vance stepped down from the buggy at the gate. Smiled, the warm, practiced smile of a man who had used charm as a tool so long he'd forgotten what genuine looked like. Miss Hargrove. I hope I'm not interrupting you are, Clara said pleasantly. But go ahead, a flicker. Then the smile returned. I wanted to come in person, out of respect for your father, and because I think we can resolve this without the unpleasantness of a court hearing. He held up a hand. I know you dispute the loan. I understand your position, but the documents are registered. The hearing will go as the law directs it. I don't think either of us wants that drawn-out process. What do you want, Mr. Vance? I want to make you a better offer. $1,000. Clean transfer. You walk away with your dignity and enough money to start fresh somewhere else. He looked around at the property. His eyes moved with the practiced assessment of someone calculating value. This is hard country for a woman alone. It would be a shame to fight a legal battle and lose everything. Clara looked at him. She thought about the map in the leather case. about the red circles, about the words probable formation written in a cramped technical hand. She thought about $1 against what might be under this ground. She thought about Gerald Penfield, who had found a map he wasn't supposed to see, who had died in an accident in 1879. She thought about her father, who had found something too, and who had died of his heart in January. Mr. Vance, she said. I have a question. He waited. How long have you known about the oil? The smile did not disappear, but something behind it went very cold, very fast. I don't know what you mean, he said. I think you do. She kept her voice conversational. Easy. I think you've known for years. I think that's why this specific land matters. Not the grass, not the water rights. What's underneath? Vance looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Eli. Mr. Cole, he said. The warmth was completely gone from his voice now. I'm surprised to find you here, I imagine you are, Eli said. Old colleagues. Vance said, almost to himself. Then back to Clara. Miss Hargrove. Whoever has been filling your head with speculation. Nobody speculated, Clara said. I read a survey map, drawn by Halloran and Sons out of Houston, dated 1882. You know the one. A pause. Brief. But she saw it. I'd be careful about spreading stories you can't support, Vance said quietly. I'd be careful about forging signatures, Clara replied. The two men on horseback shifted. Chess Malone's hand moved near his belt and then stopped. Eli didn't move, just stood, easy, present, the kind of stillness that is its own kind of statement. Vance picked up his reins. The hearing is in 10 days, he said. The offer expires tomorrow morning. He turned the buggy. Rode back down the road. Clara watched him go. He knows we have the map, Eli said. Yes, he'll move faster now. Yes, she turned back to the gate latch she'd been fixing, picked up her tools. So will we. She did not tell Eli about the sealed envelope. Not yet. That evening, alone in the study, she opened it. Her father's handwriting, the familiar uprightness of it, the architectural S. Clara. If you are reading this, then the thing I feared has happened, and I owe you the truth I should have told you years ago. My name, the name I carried before I came to Crestwood, was not simply Samuel Hargrove. I was known in certain circles as I. I worked as an investigator for the Governor's Office of Texas from 1858 to 1873. 15 years. My work was to follow the money, to find the men who were stealing land from settlers, and find the proof that would stand in court. In 1872, a woman named Martha Penfield sent word to my office about a man operating in Crestwood County. A banker. She had seen things. Her husband had seen things. I came to investigate. What I found was Dylan Vance. I spent a year building a case against him. Land fraud, coercion, document forgery going back to 1869. I had enough to convict him 3 times over. And then Vance found out I was investigating, and he sent a man to find me. And that man told me that your mother was with child, that accidents happen, that a man with something to lose ought to think carefully. Your mother was 7 months along with you, Clara. I made a choice. I buried the investigation. I handed in my resignation. I burned my credentials and came back to this land and became a rancher and never spoke of it again. That was the worst thing I ever did. Not because I chose you. I would choose you 1,000 times. But because Vance continued. Because I knew what he was and I let him keep doing it. Because other people paid the price for my silence. I lived with that every day. In this envelope you will find the following. My complete investigative record of Vance's operations from 1872 to 1873. A copy of the last report I filed before I resigned, which was submitted to the Governor's office and is still on record there, if anyone cares to look. And the document that matters most. Your grandmother was Eleanor Whitfield. Her father was Thomas Whitfield, who settled Crestwood in 1849. Thomas Whitfield filed a deed of trust in 1868 with the Governor's office, not the county court, leaving all Whitfield landholdings to his direct descendants. That deed was never revoked. It was buried. Vance paid to have it buried. Your full legal name, registered at your birth in Crestwood County, is Clara May Hargrove Whitfield. The land Vance is trying to take is the land your great-grandfather built this town on. He did not buy it. He has never legally owned a foot of it. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I am sorry for the weight I am leaving you to carry. But I raised you to be stronger than I was. And I believe you will know what to do. All my love always. Your father. Clara sat in the study for a long time. The lamp burned low. The house settled around her in its quiet nighttime sounds. She read the letter twice. Then she opened the investigative file. It was thorough, meticulous. The work of a man trained to document everything and trust nothing to memory. Names, dates, amounts, locations. Testimonies from settlers who had been defrauded. Records of land that had changed hands under duress. 8 families. 12 properties. 15 years of quiet, methodical theft. And at the bottom of the file, a copy of Thomas Whitfield's deed of trust, signed and notarized. Filed with the governor's office, Austin, Texas, October 14, 1868. She set it down. She thought about her father riding out to find Eli Cole in a dusty bunkhouse, sitting down, telling the truth plainly. She thought about what it had cost him to do that one small right thing after years of necessary silence. She thought about Edna in the garden, about Martha Penfield keeping a map for 8 years, about all the people who had known pieces of this, who had held their pieces carefully, waiting. She put the documents back in the envelope. Then she went to find Eli. Eli had gone to Dorsey's the evening before. He came back an hour before midnight and said only, "Chess is there. I sat 2 stools away. He knows I saw him. He didn't leave. Did you speak?" "No, but he looked at me twice. The second time, he held it." Eli paused. "That means something. With that means something." The next morning, Chase Malone came to the ranch alone. She found him outside, sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the paddock, looking at the dark land. She told him about the letter, about I&I, about the Whitfield deed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "Your father was I&I," he said finally. "Yes, he came to find me because he was trying to do something right. After years of having to stay silent, yes." Ellie looked at his hands. "That changes things. It changes the shape of it," Clara said. "Not the direction," he nodded slowly. Then she said, "I need to tell you something else about Vance." "And about Chess Malone." Ellie turned to look at her. "Before we go further," she said, "I need to know if Walt Malone is someone who can be reached. Someone who might have a conscience left." Ellie thought about that carefully. "Chess is a complicated man," he said. "He's been with Vance a long time, longer than me. He's done things I wouldn't do, but..." He stopped, considered. "He has a line. I always thought he had a line. Whether he'd cross back over it, I don't know. I need someone inside Vance's operation. Someone who was there, who witnessed things." Clara looked at him steadily. "You can't be my only witness. You left 12 years ago. Vance's lawyers will pick apart everything you say. But someone who's been with him recently..." "Chess knows where the bodies are buried," Eli said, figuratively. "Maybe not." He paused. "I'd have to find him alone. Without Vance's people around, can you do that?" "I can try. There's a place, Dorsey's, at the south end of town. Chess used to drink there. Old habit. If he still does, I can find him there." "Go tomorrow," Clara said, carefully. Ellie nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment. "There's something you should know," he said. "About what Vance told you today. About me being here." Clara waited. "He'll use it," Eli said. "He'll tell people I'm working against him. He'll make me the story instead of him. Say I'm a disgruntled former employee. Say I put ideas in your head. Try to make this about me and him instead of about the land and what's under it." "I know," Clara said. "That doesn't worry you. It would worry me if we had no evidence. We have evidence. We have Edna. We have Martha. We have the survey map. We have my father's files." She paused. "And we have a deed that supersedes everything Vance has ever claimed." "A deed filed in Austin," Eli said, "with the governor's office, 50 miles away. Then someone needs to go to Austin." He looked at her. "I need someone I can trust to make that ride," she said. "Someone who can walk into the governor's office and pull a file that's been sitting there since 1868 and bring it back here before the hearing." Ellie looked at the dark land. "That's 4 days riding," he said. "There and back. Gives us 2 days before the hearing. Can you do it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Who watches the ranch while I'm gone?" "Calhoun Birch owed my father a debt," Clara said. "He won't say so out loud, but I think if I ask him directly, he'll come and stay here. At least at night." Ellie thought about it. "I'll leave at first light," he said. He left before dawn. Clara stood at the gate and watched him ride south. The dark still heavy. Just the sound of hooves on hard ground, fading. She stood there after the sound was gone, just standing, feeling the weight of what was in motion. 9 days. She turned back to the house. There was work to do. That same morning, Chess Malone came to the ranch. Not with Vance, alone. Clara saw him coming and went to the gate. He stopped his horse 6 feet back. "Didn't try to come through, I want to talk," he said. Without Vance knowing, she looked at him carefully. The broad face, the constant eye movement, the way he sat his horse like a man braced for impact. "Talk," she said. He didn't dismount. He looked past her at the house, at the yard, making sure they were alone. "Vance is planning to move faster now," he said. "He knows you're not going to sell. He knows you've got something. He's going to try to make sure the hearing never matters." "How?" "He's going to put pressure on Greer, more than usual. He's going to have your witnesses discredited before they can speak." A pause. "And he's going to do something to make you look unstable. Make it look like you're not competent to manage the property. That you need it taken from you for your own good." Clara kept her face neutral. "Why are you telling me this?" Chess looked at his hands on the reins. "Because I've been with Dylan Vance for 14 years, he said, "and I've done things I'm not proud of. But I have a line. And watching him go after a woman alone on her dead father's land." He stopped, started again. "I've been telling myself for years that most of what we did was business. Just business. Nobody really gets hurt. They move on. They find somewhere else." He looked at her directly. "I know that's not true. I've always known it. I just didn't want to." Clara said nothing. "Let him find his way." "The family Delacroix," he said. "That Eli Cole told you about. I know what happened to them after we pushed them off. They didn't find somewhere else. They ended up in Abilene with nothing, living in a church hall, and the old man died that winter." He paused. "I drove past that church hall. I knew it. I kept riding. The morning was warming up. Birds starting their noise." "What do you want, Mr. Malone?" Clara asked. "I want to testify," he said, "at the hearing. I'll tell them what I know. About the forgery. About the intimidation. About—" He stopped. Looked at the ground. "About your father." Clara went very still. "What about my father?" Chess Malone looked at her. The constant eye movement stopped. He just looked at her straight. "Your father didn't die of his heart," he said. "I don't know how. I wasn't the one who did it. But I was in Vance's office when he said your father was becoming a problem. When he said it needed to be handled quietly." His voice was flat, careful. 3 weeks later, Samuel Hargrove was dead. The world went very quiet around Clara. She had known. Some part of her had known since she stood in that examination room and looked at her father's hands. But knowing a thing in your bones and hearing it said out loud are different things. "Who?" she asked. Her voice was steady. "I don't know for certain. I think Dr. Aldridge was involved. I think it was slow. Something that would look natural." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry. I should have come to you sooner." Clara breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. "Will you put all of that in a sworn statement?" "Yes." "Will you stand in a public hearing and say it out loud?" A pause. Shorter than she expected. "Yes." "Then you need to stay safe until the hearing," she said. "Don't go back to Vance. Don't go back to wherever you've been staying." "Is there somewhere you can go that Vance doesn't know about?" he thought. "I've got a cousin out past the ridge, 8 miles east. Go there. Stay there. Don't come into town until the hearing." He nodded. Then he turned his horse. "Miss Hargrove," she looked up. "Your father," Chess said. "He was the only man in 20 years who came to any of us and spoke plain. No threats, no deals. Just said what was true and let us make our choice." He looked at her. "You've got his way about you. I noticed it the first time I saw you at Vance's office." He turned and rode east. Clara stood at the gate for a long time. Then she went inside to write down everything he had said, word for word, while it was still fresh. The days moved fast and slow at once. The way time moves when everything matters. Clara rode the fence line every morning, mapping the full extent of the moved posts. She had a surveyor's eye, another gift from her father, who had taught her to use a compass and a measuring line before she was 10. She documented everything, compared it to her father's original survey records. The discrepancy, fully measured, was not small. If the fence line had stayed where Vance's men had moved it, the Hargrove ranch would have lost 37 acres. 37 acres that contained, according to the geological map, the central section of the probable formation. She went through her father's file one more time. 8 families. She wrote each name on a separate sheet. Henderson. Kowalski, a Polish family who had come to Texas in 1871 with 4 grown sons and a deed they'd saved 3 years to buy. Brewer. Delacroix. 4 more she had not yet put faces to. 8 families. 12 properties. Her father had taught her that too. The cleaner the record, the harder it is to dismiss. Calhoun Birch came as she'd asked. He showed up the evening after Eli left. No announcement. Just rode up, tied his horse at the post and said, "I'll sleep in the barn if that's all right. I'm not much for fine accommodations." Clara showed him the bunk in the barn. He didn't ask questions. He just sat on the porch in the evenings with a rifle across his knees and kept watch. On the 3rd night he said, "I should have done more. When you came to my office." "You're here now," Clara said. I looked the other way for a long time. It was easier. He looked out at the dark. A man tells himself that if he just does his job and doesn't make trouble, things will sort themselves out. But they don't sort themselves out. They just get worse while you're looking away. Clara thought about her father. About 15 years of silence. About the choice he'd made. "My father looked away too," she said. "For good reasons, and he spent the rest of his life regretting it. But he didn't spend that time doing nothing. He kept records. He kept the deed. He kept the evidence." She paused. "Sometimes looking away is the wrong choice. Sometimes it's the only choice you have. The question is what you do with the time it buys you." Calhoun was quiet for a while. "What can I do?" he asked, concretely. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be a deputy sheriff in that hearing room," she said. "I need Vance to know you're there and that you're watching. I need him to understand that whatever he's planning, it won't go unwitnessed." "I can do that," Calhoun said. "And I need you to send a telegraph to the sheriff's office in Austin. From you as a peace officer, requesting confirmation of a public record. I'll write what to say." He nodded. Tomorrow morning, Martha Penfield came by on the 5th day. She brought a jar of preserves, blackberry the good kind, and sat down at the kitchen table with Clara and Edna. "I heard Chess Malone left Vance's employ," she said without preamble. She had the information-gathering instincts of a woman who had spent decades paying attention in a small town. "Where did you hear that?" Clara asked. "Floyd Garrett. He hears everything eventually." She set the preserves down. "I also heard Vance has been spending time at Greer's house in the evenings. Long visits." Clara and Edna exchanged a look. "He's working on the judge," Edna said. "He's always worked on the judge," Martha said. "For years. Greer's not a bad man, he's a weak one. There's a difference. A bad man doesn't feel the weight of what he does. Greer feels it. He just can't find the backbone to set it down. He showed up in a public place," Clara said. "He stood next to Eli when Vance had a gun out." She told Martha what had happened at Vance's initial visit. The gun. The moment. Greer stepping out from behind his usual shelter. Martha listened. Then she said something unexpected. "Emmett Greer's father was a schoolteacher," she said. "Came to Crestwood in 1855. Taught every child in this county for 20 years, including Samuel Hargrove, including the children of half the families on that list in your father's files." She looked at Clara. "Emmett knows what this town was supposed to be. He knows what it became. He has to live in the gap between those two things every day." Clara thought about that. Knowing the right thing and doing it. Clara said, "Aren't the same thing." "No," Martha agreed. "But they're the beginning of the same road. 7 days. 6, 5 Eli was somewhere on the road back from Austin." She hoped. She kept working. She organized the evidence into 4 categories. The forged loan, the intimidation and arson, her father's investigative file, and the Whitfield deed. Each category had its supporting documents. Each document had a clear chain of evidence. She wrote out a clear, simple summary of each. Plain language, no legal jargon. The kind of language you could read aloud to a room full of ordinary people and have them understand it in 60 seconds. Her father had taught her that too. The truth should not need translation. On the 4th night before the hearing, the second fire came. She'd been half expecting it. This one was bigger. The North Hay barn, not the small storage shed, the real barn. 40 feet long, full of winter feed. Calhoun was on the porch. He saw the glow before Clara did and was moving before she woke. She heard him shout, heard him running, and came out of the house pulling on her coat. The fire was already big. Too big for buckets. They worked anyway. Calhoun, Edna, Clara. An hour of desperate work with buckets from the trough and wet sacking. They saved the structure, barely. Lost most of the hay. When it was down to smoking ruin, Clara stood and looked at the building. Winter feed. Gone. The horses would need feeding before the next hay season. That meant buying feed, at a price she didn't have, or selling stock she couldn't afford to sell. Vance was methodical. She had to give him that. Every move designed to squeeze, designed to make the land cost more than it was worth to hold. She looked at the smoking barn. She thought about Thomas Whitfield, her great-grandfather, who had come to this land in 1849 with nothing, who had dug the first well and laid the first stone and set the first post, who had built something from nothing, in hard country, in hard times. The land had cost him. It had cost Samuel. It was costing her. That was the nature of land worth keeping. 4 days, she said, to no one in particular. She went inside to wash the smoke from her hands. Eli came back on the morning of the third day before the hearing. He rode into the yard at dawn. His horse was tired. He was tired. 4 days' hard riding showed on both of them. He pulled something from his saddlebag as he dismounted, an envelope. Official. The seal of the governor's office of Texas embossed on the front. They had it, he said, filed and sealed and sitting in a cabinet. Clark said nobody had asked for it in 20 years. He handed it to her. But it's there. It's real. It's signed and dated, and everything it needs to be. Clara took the envelope. She held it for a moment. Thomas Whitfield's deed of trust. The original. Certified copy with the governor's seal. Was there anyone there who remembered my father, she asked. Eli thought. One man. Old Clark, been there 30 years. When I said the name I&I, he knew it right away. Said he paused. Said your father was the best investigator they ever had. Said it was a waste when he resigned. He met her eyes. Said he always wondered if it was voluntary. Clara nodded. How's Chess? Eli asked. Safe. He's with his cousin. He'll be at the hearing. Eli looked at the barn. The smoke darkened walls. The missing roof section. The fire was recent, he said. 3 nights ago. He looked at her, the question in his eyes. I'm fine, she said. The land is fine. We're ready. He looked at her for a long moment. The tiredness in his face, the road dust, and behind it something that had not been there when he first arrived. Something steadier. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. Then it ends. She turned and walked back toward the house, the governor's envelope in her hand. The morning light coming up golden over 400 acres of grass and everything under it. 3 days. And then Clara May Hargrove Whitfield was going to stand up in this town and say her name out loud. 3 days felt like 3 different kinds of weather. The first day was cold and clear. The kind of day that makes you think clearly whether you want to or not. Clara spent it at the kitchen table. Everything spread out in front of her. Every document, every piece of evidence. Organized into 4 neat stacks with written summaries on top. She read through all of it twice. Not looking for new information, looking for holes, looking for the places Vance's lawyers would push, the places that could be made to look uncertain or confused or incomplete. She found 3 the first. Edna's testimony. A woman who had signed a document under duress, without a witness of her own, in her own kitchen. Easy to reframe as a confused elderly woman acting on her own initiative. The second, Martha's map, geological survey from 1882. No chain of custody, no clear link to Vance, just a map Gerald Penfield had taken from an office where he had no business being. The third, Chess Malone, a 14-year employee of Vance, suddenly switching sides 3 days before a hearing. Every lawyer in Texas would call that convenient. She wrote down the weaknesses, stared at them. Then she wrote down what answered each one. Edna's testimony was weak alone, but paired with the forged signature analysis and the loan document that matched no record in Samuel's files. It built a picture. You didn't need the testimony to be perfect. You needed it to be consistent with everything around it. Martha's map was weak as a standalone exhibit, but paired with Chess's testimony about what Vance knew and when, and paired with the geological reality of what was under the ground, it built a motive. Motive changes everything. Motive turns coincidence into pattern. Chess was weak because he'd waited, but people wait. They wait because they're afraid. They wait because they need something to finally push them. The thing that pushes them doesn't make their testimony false. It just makes them human. She wrote that down too. Being afraid doesn't make you a liar. It makes you someone who needed time to find their courage. She thought about her father. 15 years of silence, and then quietly, carefully, he had started to prepare, started to leave things behind for her. For this moment, he had been afraid too, and he had still done the work. Eli spent the first day rebuilding the hay barn roof. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce it. He got up before dawn, assessed the damage, and started working. By the time Clara came out in the morning, he had the burned section cleared and was measuring timber. She brought him coffee and stood watching for a moment. "You don't have to do this today," she said. "Horses need shelter," he said. "Weather won't wait for court hearings." She left him to it. By evening, the roof was half rebuilt. Not perfect, but solid. The kind of work that said, "This building is going to stand." She thought that was deliberate. The second day was harder. Word had gotten around Crestwood, the way it always does in small towns. Not through any single conversation, but through the accumulation of 100 small ones. A word here, a look there. The particular silence that descends when everyone knows something is coming, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Clara rode into town to send a final telegraph. Austin to the governor's office, confirming the certified copy of the Whitfield deed was authentic and on record. On the main street, she felt the shift, not the pity from before. Something different now, more complicated. Some people looked away faster than usual. That was fear. Vance's kind of influence moved through a town like groundwater, invisible but present everywhere. People who had nothing to do with any of this still felt it, still made choices to stay out of it. You couldn't blame them for that. Fear of a powerful man is rational. It takes something specific to overcome it. But some people didn't look away. The woman who ran the laundry, Mrs. Aldersham, nodded at Clara as she passed. A real nod. Deliberate, the two men sitting outside the feed store who stopped talking when Clara walked by. One of them, an older man she recognized as Henderson, the son of a family named in her father's files, watched her walk by and then said something quietly to the other. She didn't hear it. But he was watching her with something that wasn't pity. Floyd Garrett, when she came in for a small order, said nothing. But when he bagged it, he put in the salt again. This time she understood what it meant. "We see you. We can't say so out loud, but we see you." She rode home thinking about all the ways people resist when they can't resist openly. The small dignities, the quiet steadfastness, all the ways ordinary people hold on to something true even when it costs them to do it. Her father had known about that, had counted on it. He had trusted that Crestwood, underneath the fear, was still the town Thomas Whitfield had built. She was going to find out if he was right. The third day, Vance made his last move. A letter arrived by county messenger, addressed to Clara Hargrove, official county stationery. It informed her that in light of new information regarding her mental and emotional state following her father's death, the court was requesting a competency assessment prior to the hearing. If she failed to appear before Dr. Aldridge for evaluation by end of business that day, the court reserved the right to appoint a property guardian, pending the outcome of the hearing. She read it twice, then she sat very still for a moment. Dr. Aldridge. The man Chess believed had helped kill her father. The man Vance owned. If she went to Aldridge, the assessment would find whatever Vance needed it to find. If she didn't go, Greer would use her absence as grounds to appoint a guardian, which meant Vance's man, controlling the property, before the hearing even started. It was elegant. She had to give him that. She thought about it for exactly 10 minutes. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a response. She addressed it to Judge Emmett Greer, not to the county court generally. To the judge specifically. She wrote it by hand. Her clearest handwriting. "Dear Judge Greer, I have received a letter purporting to be from your court requesting a competency assessment. I note that this letter was not signed by you personally, nor does it carry your personal seal. I am writing directly to you to ask a simple question. Did you authorize this letter? If you did, I will present myself for assessment by a physician of the court's choosing. Not Dr. Aldridge, whose relationship with Mr. Vance I am prepared to document in detail at tomorrow's hearing. If you did not, I think you already know what this letter represents. And I think you know what it says about the man who sent it. I will see you tomorrow, Your Honor. I trust you will be there. Respectfully, Clara May Hargrove. She sent it by hand with Calhoun Birch, who rode it to Greer's house personally. Greer sent no reply. But the competency letter was never acted upon. She was up at 4, not because she couldn't sleep. She had slept. Deeply and without dreams, the way you sleep when you have done everything you can do and the rest is no longer in your hands. She was up at 4 because she wanted the time. She lit the lamp in the study, sat at her father's desk, looked at the surface of it, the worn wood, the ink stain at the left corner that had been there since before she was born, the small groove where Samuel Hargrove had rested his pen 10,000 times. She put her hand flat on the desk. She sat like that for a while, not thinking about the hearing, not running through arguments or evidence, just sitting at her father's desk in the quiet and feeling the presence of everything he had been. The man who had built the fence post by post, the man who had ridden out to find Eli Cole in a bunkhouse and told him the truth without weapons, the man who had chosen his daughter over justice and spent the rest of his life trying to do both from inside that choice. He was not perfect. She had made her peace with that. A man who was perfect wouldn't have needed to leave her a letter explaining himself. A perfect man wouldn't have had anything to explain, but he was good. In the deep, useful, costly way that goodness works in the real world. Not goodness as an absence of failure, goodness as a direction. Something you keep moving toward even when you stumble. She thought about what he had said. I raised you to be stronger than I was, she thought. Maybe that's not quite right. Maybe the right way to say it was. He had raised her to be strong in the ways he had taught her to be strong. And then he had left her the tools to finish what he hadn't been able to. Not because she was stronger, but because she had the advantage of knowing from him exactly what she was walking into. He had prepared her for this specific morning. She stood up from his desk. She was ready. She dressed carefully, not for appearance, for herself. There is a way you dress when you know the day matters. When you want to feel, in your own skin, like someone who is clear about who they are and what they're doing. Her father's pocket watch. She put it in her coat pocket. The documents organized, labeled in a satchel she had used since she was a girl. She walked out into the dark yard, the stars still up. An hour before dawn, Eli was already there, saddled. Waiting, she looked at him. You don't have to come, she said. You've done enough. What you did, riding to Austin, that was the thing that made all of this possible. He looked at her steadily. I'm coming. Vance's lawyers will use your history against you, I know. It will be uncomfortable, Miss Hargrove. He said it the way he said everything. Plain, direct. My wife and my brother died because of this man. I would walk through considerably worse than uncomfortable to see this through, she nodded. They rode toward Crestwood in the dark, side by side, neither of them talking. The sky lightened slowly ahead of them, pink at the edges first, then orange, then the full wide gold of a Texas morning coming up over the flat horizon. Clara thought, whatever happens today, I will have done what was right. That's the only thing you can ever be certain of going in. The town had been expecting something. By the time Clara and Eli rode down the main street, at 8 in the morning, people were already gathering. Not in the courthouse. Judge Greer's court was a small room in the county building, space for maybe 40 people. But outside, on the street, on the boardwalk, the way people gather when they sense that something is going to happen that they'll want to have witnessed. Calhoun Birch met them at the gate of the county building. He was in his full deputy's uniform, straight. Present, Chess is here, he said quietly. Came in an hour ago. He's inside. How does he look? Clara asked, nervous. But solid. She nodded. Good. Inside, the room was already full, every seat taken. People standing along the walls. More than Clara had expected. She recognized faces from all over the county, farmers, shopkeepers, the woman from the laundry, the man named Henderson from outside the feed store. Floyd Garrett was in the back row. He caught her eye, said nothing, nodded once. She walked to the front. Vance was already there. His legal team, 2 men from Austin, expensive and sharp. He saw her come in. His face did not change. The smooth surface held, but his eyes went to her satchel. Calculating what was in it, Chess Malone was on the far side of the room. He looked like a man who had decided something and was going to live with it. The nervous energy was there. But underneath it, that line he'd talked about, the one he'd finally found his way back across. Judge Emmett Greer came in at exactly 9. He was a tall man, thin, grey at the temples. He had the face of someone who had spent a long time trying to look more certain than he felt. He sat, arranged his papers, did not look at Vance. Clara noticed that, filed it away. This hearing, Greer began, his voice even, is convened to determine the legal status of the debt claim filed by the Crestwood Savings and Land Bank against the estate of Samuel R. Hargrove, deceased. Additionally, the court will hear any relevant counterclaims. He looked up. Mr. Vance's representation will present first. Vance's lead lawyer was named Aldous Crane. He was good, methodical and smooth, the way good lawyers are. He presented the loan document with confidence. He had the bank's records. He had 2 notary stamps. He had an affidavit from the bank clerk who claimed to have witnessed the signing. It was a clean presentation. Clara had to admit that. If you didn't know what she knew, it would have been convincing. When Crane finished, Greer turned to Clara, Miss Hargrove. You may present your response, she stood, opened her satchel, placed her documents on the table in front of her. Thank you, Your Honor. She spoke clearly. Not fast, not slow. The way her father had taught her to speak when she needed people to actually hear what she was saying. She started with the signature analysis, simple, side-by-side comparison. 23 years of Samuel Hargrove's documented handwriting against the signature on the loan document. She explained what she had observed. The capital S, the specific angle, the consistency across 40 examples. Crane objected immediately. Not a legal expert. Personal observation, no standing. Greer sustained it. The signature analysis was struck. Clara had expected that. She moved to Edna. Edna stood up from the second row. She walked to the front of the room, 65 years old, moving carefully, and about as unbendable as timber. She told her story, the 2 men, the kitchen, the threat about Clara's morning ride, the signature she had written with her own hand. She told it plainly, without drama. The way a woman tells the truth when she has decided that is the only thing left worth doing. Crane cross-examined her hard. Confused elderly woman, acting on her own initiative. Samuel must have told her. She misunderstood the men's visit. Edna answered every question the same way, calmly, without anger, with the patience of someone who had been carrying the truth for months and was glad to finally set it down. I know what happened in my own kitchen, she said. I have known it every day since it happened. I signed that document because a man described Clara's morning ride in a way that made his meaning clear. I did it to protect her, and I will say so as many times as you need me to say it. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Crane let her go. Clara presented Martha Penfield's map next. Martha came forward herself, explained where it had come from, what it showed, what her husband had believed about how he came to have it. Crane objected to the map as hearsay and unsupported speculation. Greer sustained it. The map was excluded as direct evidence. Agon. Clara had expected that. She called Chess Malone. The room shifted when he stood. Vance, for the first time, moved slightly in his seat. Chess walked to the front of the room. He looked at Vance once. Then he looked at the judge and nowhere else. He told what he knew. Methodically. 14 years of observation. The land acquisition strategy. The systematic document forgery. The intimidation of settlers. He named names. He named dates. He named amounts. And then he said, I was present in Dylan Vance's office on December 3rd, 1886, when he stated that Samuel Hargrove was becoming an unacceptable risk and needed to be handled quietly. 3 weeks later, Samuel Hargrove was dead. The room erupted. Greer called for order. Got it eventually. Crane went after Chess with everything he had. Disgruntled former employee. No corroboration. Convenient timing. A man with his own legal exposure trying to buy leniency. Chess absorbed it. Did not waver. I'm not buying anything, he said. I have no deal with this court or anyone in it. I am saying what I saw, what I heard, because it's the truth. And because I've been not saying it long enough, when Chess sat down, Clara looked at the room. She looked at Henderson, at the woman from the laundry, at Floyd in the back row. She looked at Judge Emmett Greer. He had been taking notes throughout. His face gave nothing away. But his pen had not stopped moving since Chess began speaking. Crane made his closing argument. It was thorough and professional. He dismantled each piece of evidence in turn. The signature analysis excluded, the map excluded, Edna's testimony uncorroborated, Chess's testimony self-interested and unverifiable. He was right about all of it, technically. Clara knew that going in the law moves on what can be proven in the specific ways the law requires, not on what is true. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they aren't. When Crane finished, the room waited. Greer looked at his notes for a long moment. Then he looked up. This court has reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony. The objections raised by Mr. Crane regarding the admissibility of certain evidence are legally valid. The excluded materials cannot form the basis of this ruling. Clara kept her face still. The loan document presented by the Crestwood Savings and Land Bank remains the legally registered instrument before this court. The counter-testimony provided, while heard and noted, does not meet the evidentiary threshold required to invalidate a registered financial instrument under Texas property law. He paused. It is therefore the ruling of this court. The room had gone absolutely silent, that the debt claim stands. The property known as the Hargrove Ranch, 400 acres in Crestwood County, is to be transferred to the Crestwood Savings and Land Bank within 30 days, in satisfaction of the registered debt. The silence held for one long second. Then the room broke open. Not shouting, not chaos, just the particular noise of a large group of people absorbing something they hadn't fully believed would happen. The shift of bodies, the murmur, the sound of air going out of a room. Clara stood still. She had prepared for this. She had told herself she had prepared for this. It still landed like a stone. 30 days. The ranch. Everything Samuel Hargrove had built. She looked at Eli. He met her eyes, said nothing, but he was still standing. She looked at Vance. He was leaning toward Crane, saying something quietly. There was the beginning of satisfaction in his face, the particular loosening of a man who has been holding tension and feels it releasing. And then he made his mistake. He looked at Clara, and he smiled. Not the warm, practiced smile from his office. Something smaller and realer and worse. The smile of a man who has just won something he has been trying to win for a very long time. Clara looked at that smile, and something settled in her. Quiet and clear and completely without doubt. She opened her satchel. She took out the governor's envelope. She took out her father's file. She took out the document she had not yet presented, the one she had been holding back. Not strategically, because she had wanted to see first whether the law could do its work without it. It couldn't. So now it was time, Your Honor. Her voice cut through the noise of the room. Greer looked up. The room quieted. I have one additional submission, she said. It was not presented earlier because it is not a counter-argument to the loan claim. It supersedes the loan claim entirely. Under a separate and prior legal instrument, Crane was on his feet. Your Honor. The ruling can be amended if new material evidence is presented before it is recorded, Greer said. And something in his voice had changed, something that had not been there before. Sit down, Mr. Crane. Crane sat. Greer looked at Clara. Present your submission. She placed the governor's envelope on the table. Opened it. Removed the certified copy. This is a deed of trust filed by Thomas Whitfield with the Governor's Office of Texas on October 14, 1868. It is certified authentic by that office, under seal, retrieved 4 days ago by personal request. She laid it flat. Thomas Whitfield was the founder of Crestwood. He settled this land in 1849. He registered this deed before his death to ensure the land passed legally to his direct descendants. 200 people breathing. That was the only sound. My mother was Eleanor Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield's only child. She placed her birth certificate beside the deed. My full legal name, registered at my birth in this county, is Clara May Hargrove Whitfield. She let that sit for a moment. The Whitfield deed predates every land claim Dylan Vance has ever made in Crestwood County. It predates the bank's founding. It predates every transaction Vance has conducted in this county. And under its terms, no Whitfield land can be transferred without the direct consent of a living Whitfield heir. She looked up. I am that heir. And I have not consented to anything. Vance stood up. The smooth surface cracked. Not completely, but enough. This is fabricated, he said. His voice was still controlled. But it had an edge now, a pressure behind it. A document produced 4 days before a hearing. Produced from the governor's office, Greer said quietly. Under official seal, it can be investigated. It can be, Mr. Vance. Greer's voice had changed completely now. Something had come into it. Something that sounded, Clara thought, like a man who had been standing at a door for a long time and had finally decided to open it. Sit down. Vance looked at the judge. Greer looked back at him and did not look away. Vance sat. The room began to understand what it had just heard. It moved through the space the way things move through a crowd, person by person, the whisper of it. The realization. Henderson stood up in his row. He didn't say anything. He just stood. The way people stand when they want to be counted. The woman from the laundry stood. Floyd Garrett stood up from the back row, one by one. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough people standing to make the room feel different than it had a moment ago. Vance looked around at them, and Clara saw it. The moment. The thing she had been watching for. He reached inside his jacket, the small gun, the one she had seen him touch in his office weeks ago. He had it out before anyone fully processed what was happening. He pointed it at Clara. This ends now, he said. The room froze. Greer had not moved from his bench. He sat completely still. And Clara, even in that moment, watched his face. She saw it happen. The thing that had been building in him since she'd sent that letter, since Chess had spoken, since he'd looked at his own handwriting in 12 years of rulings and understood, finally, the shape of what he'd built with it. He stood up. Ellie moved. Not toward Vance. He stepped in front of Clara, no weapon in his hand. Just himself. Standing between her and the gun. You're in a room full of witnesses, Vance, he said. His voice was the same as it always was. Quiet, even, completely steady. Every person in this room is watching you hold that gun. Think about what happens next. Vance's hand was shaking slightly, not with fear, with the particular tremor of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. Calhoun Birch had his hand on his own weapon, still, waiting. The room was absolutely silent. And then Judge Emmett Greer stood up from his bench. He walked around the table, slowly. He stood beside Eli. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just stood there. A judge who had spent 12 years looking away, standing in the open where everyone could see him. Vance looked at Greer. Something went out of Vance's face. It was not surrender exactly. It was more like the moment when a man realizes that the story he has been telling himself about who he is no longer holds together. When the architecture of justification finally collapses, his hand lowered, the gun came down. Calhoun moved fast. Professional, the weapon was gone from Vance's hand before he'd fully decided to let it go. It was over. Not the legal work. Not the investigation that would follow. Not the months of court proceedings that would come after this morning. But the particular power Dylan Vance had held over Crestwood for 15 years. That was over. Clara could feel it. The room could feel it. The way you feel a pressure release that you've been living inside so long. You'd forgotten it was pressure. She had one more thing to say. Greer had called for order. The room had settled into the particular quiet of people who have witnessed something they will describe to their children and their grandchildren. Your Honor, Clara said. May I address the room? Greer looked at her. He nodded. She turned to face the people. She looked at them. All of them. Henderson and Floyd and the woman from the laundry, and Martha Penfield in the third row, and Edna sitting straight-backed in the second, and Chess Malone on the side. His jaw set, watching. She looked at all of them and she said, My name is Clara May Hargrove Whitfield. She said it the way you say the thing that is simply true. No performance. No drama. My great-grandfather built this town. He dug the first well on this land. He set the first boundary post. He built the first church. He built it because he believed a town was not just a collection of buildings and transactions. It was a community. People who owed each other something. People who kept faith with each other. She paused. For 15 years that faith has been used against you. The trust you put in your institutions, your bank, your court, your local officials, was treated as an opportunity. Not by everyone, not by most of you, but by one man who understood how to use the appearance of legitimacy to take what wasn't his. She looked at Henderson, the family Henderson, whose land was taken in 1873. Henderson stood straighter, the family Kowalski, the Brewer family, the Delacroix family, who came from Louisiana with nothing but a deed and a will to build something. She named each family from her father's file. 8 families, 12 properties. 15 years, my father documented all of it. Not because he could act on it immediately, but because he believed the truth needed to be preserved. He believed that a record, kept carefully and honestly, was its own kind of justice. Because records outlast men. They outlast intimidation. They outlast power. She reached into her satchel one final time. What I am asking this court to do today is simple. Recognize the Whitfield deed. Recognize the fraud committed against my father's estate. And open a full investigation into every land transaction Dylan Vance has conducted in Crestwood County since 1869. She set the last document on Greer's table. That is all. She sat down. Greer was quiet for a long moment, then he began to speak. He was not eloquent. He was not dramatic. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is trying to be honest for the first time in a long time and is finding his footing. He acknowledged the Whitfield deed, declared it valid pending verification, which the governor's seal made straightforward. He stayed the land transfer ruling pending that verification. He ordered Vance held on the weapons charge. He called for a county-level investigation into the land claims named in Samuel Hargrove's file. He noted, for the record, that the court would additionally refer the circumstances of Samuel Hargrove's death to the county coroner for independent review, naming Dr. Aldridge's prior involvement with the bank as grounds for that referral. Dr. Aldridge's surgery was shuttered by the following week. He did not stay in Crestwood to answer for it, but the referral was on record, and records, as Samuel Hargrove had always believed, outlast the men who make them. He did not apologize. Not in those words, but he said at the end, this court should have seen more clearly, sooner. That is a matter this court will have to reckon with, but we begin today. We begin with what's in front of us. He looked at Clara, one moment, direct, then he closed his ledger, and the hearing was done. Outside, the morning had gone full and warm. People came out blinking into the light. The way you do when you've been somewhere that required all of your attention, and you return to the ordinary world, and it seems both the same as you left it and different. Martha Penfield found Clara on the steps. She took both of Clara's hands in her old ones. Didn't say anything. Just held them for a moment. Henderson came over. He was a man of about 50. Big hands, like his father would have had. My father talked about that land until the day he died, he said. Couldn't let it go. We always thought it was just grief. Couldn't accept what happened. He looked at her. Turns out it wasn't grief. He was right, Clara said. What happens now? For the families, I mean, that's going to take time, Clara said honestly. The legal process, the investigation, it won't be fast. But the record is open now. The truth is on record. And that's the beginning, he nodded. Shook her hand with both of his. Eli found her sitting on the steps of the county building an hour later. The crowd had mostly dispersed. Vance had been taken to the county jail. Crane and his partner had departed in a very expensive and very silent buggy. Chess Malone was talking to Calhoun Birch about his formal statement. Ellie sat beside her on the step. They sat without speaking for a while. Your wife's name was Sarah, Clara said eventually. Sarah Grace Cole, he said. She used to make cornbread that was better than anything I've ever eaten since. I told her that for 12 years and she never got tired of hearing it. And Boyd was 3 years older than me and thought that entitled him to an opinion on everything I did. Something came into Eli's voice. Not sadness exactly. The particular tenderness of someone speaking about loss that has found its shape over a long time. He was usually right. I usually didn't tell him so. I'm sorry, I know. He looked at the street. I've been carrying it wrong for 12 years. Carrying it like it was my fault. Like I was the one who failed them. He was quiet a moment. It wasn't. I know that now. It doesn't make them less gone, but it changes what the weight is made of. She understood that. She thought about her own weight, about Samuel Hargrove, about the father who was not perfect, who had made a choice and carried it, and then spent 20 years trying to make something right from inside the consequences. I found something in his study, she said. A month ago. Before any of this started, she looked at her hands. A collection of letters he'd written but never sent, to the families in his file, explaining what he knew, what he'd found, what he couldn't do at the time, and what he hoped would be done eventually. He wrote to them. Every family. 8 letters. He never sent them because he thought, correctly, that if Vance intercepted them, it would endanger the families, so he kept them. Waiting for the right time, she paused. I'm going to send them, not instead of the legal process, in addition to it, so the families know that someone saw what happened to them, that it was documented, that it mattered. Ellie was quiet for a moment. That was your father? Yes. Good man, yes, Clara said. He was. She rode home in the late afternoon. Not fast. She let Dulcie set her own pace. The land spread out around her, golden in the fall light, the grass moving in the slow wind, the big sky. She thought about Thomas Whitfield in 1849, riding across this same land, looking at it for the first time, choosing it, deciding here this is where. She thought about what it takes to begin something, the particular courage of starting with nothing and choosing to believe that what you build will matter, that someone will carry it forward. Thomas Whitfield had built a town. Samuel Hargrove had built a ranch, and a record, and a daughter. She was the carrying forward. She thought about that, about what she was going to build now, not just defend. Build. The land was here. The deed was acknowledged. The oil was still under the ground, patient and unchanged. There would be decisions to make about it. She would make them carefully and on her own terms. The barn needed its roof finished. The winter feed needed replacing. The fence line needed to be restored to its proper positions and documented with a proper survey. There was a great deal of practical work to do. She was not afraid of practical work. She came through the gate as the sun was setting. Eli was finishing the last section of the barn roof. She could see him up there in the fading light. Methodical. Steady Edna was on the porch, sitting in her usual chair, straight-backed. When Clara rode in, Edna looked up, and for the first time in months, what was on her face was not the weight of what she'd done, or fear about what was coming. It was just Edna, just the woman who had been here 30 years and intended to be here 30 more. Clara put up Dulcie and walked to the porch. She sat in the other chair, the one her father used to sit in. The sun finished going down. The stars appeared, first one. Then 100. After a while, Eli came down from the barn roof. He washed his hands at the pump, looked at the finished repair. Then he came and sat on the porch step. The 3 of them sat there as the night came fully in, not talking, just sitting in the way of people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the silence. After a long while, Edna said, "I'll make supper." She went inside. The lamp came on in the kitchen window, the warm yellow of it falling out across the yard. After a while, Eli said, "I was thinking." Clara waited. The west pasture fence needs rebuilding. All of it. Won't hold through winter as it stands, I know. That's 3 weeks of work at least. Maybe 4, at least. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "If that's what you're asking." "I wasn't asking. I know." He looked at his hands. "I'm saying it anyway." Clara looked at the lamp in the kitchen window. "All right," she said. That was enough. For both of them, it was enough. Clara looked at it. She thought, that light is what her father had chosen, over the other thing. Over the justice he couldn't have and protect his family at the same time. He had chosen this light, this ordinary, irreplaceable thing. She understood him better now than she ever had when he was alive. That is the strange gift of loss. You keep learning from the people you've lost. They keep teaching you things, long after they can't speak anymore. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the weight of his pocket watch. You were right, she thought, about most of it. And where you were wrong, you knew it. And where you knew it, you tried to fix it. That's all any of us can do. She went out early the next morning before dawn, before Eli was up, before Edna had the coffee started. She rode to the eastern fence line. to the section where the posts had been moved. She had the measurements. She had the survey documents. She knew exactly where each post needed to be. She started at the beginning. She pulled the first wrongly placed post, carried it to the correct position, set it in the ground, packed the soil firm around it. Then the next, and the next. The sky lightened slowly over the flat eastern horizon. Pink, then orange, then the full clear gold of morning. She worked steadily, not fast. Right, her father had built this fence in the summer of 1861, post by post, with 2 mules and a hammer and a deed he'd earned through honest work. She was setting it straight again. Some things you have to do yourself, not because you're the only one who can, but because doing it yourself is how you know it's done. When the last post was set, she stood back, looked along the line. Straight, clean, true. She put her hand on the last post, left it there for a moment. Then she turned her horse toward home. The land stretched out around her in the morning light, all of it, every acre, the grass and the sky and whatever was underneath. All of it exactly what it had always been, hers, not because a court had said so, though it had, not because a deed had said so, though it did because Samuel Hargrove had built it, and Thomas Whitfield had settled it. And all of them, in their different ways, had loved it enough to pay the cost of keeping it, and now she would carry it forward, the same way you carry anything worth keeping, one day at a time, one true thing at a time, all the way home.